The revolving glass doors of the Grandview Lux Hotel in Des Moines, Iowa, spun with a soft, almost musical hum, catching the amber glow of a late September sunset. Through them stepped Andrea Mitchell, a 48-year-old Black CEO, her presence a quiet force like a river that carves stone without a sound. Her dusty blue silk blouse shimmered faintly under the crystal chandeliers, her tailored slacks moved with effortless grace, and her soft loafers whispered against the polished marble floor. A worn canvas duffel hung from her shoulder. No designer labels, no entourage, no need for ostentation. She was here for one night, a brief pause before a board meeting she hadn't planned to attend in person. All she wanted was a key, a warm bed, and a moment to gather her thoughts. But as she crossed the threshold of her own hotel, a monument to her life's work, bearing the Mitchell name, the world tilted. The lobby was a masterpiece of understated opulence, vaulted ceilings adorned with intricate gold leaf, velvet armchairs nestled in alcoves, the air laced with the faint scent of jasmine and cedarwood. Guests moved through the space like actors in a well-rehearsed play business, travelers in crisp suits, a couple in golf pools laughing over martinis, a family with a toddler clutching a stuffed bear. Behind the front desk, a young receptionist, Sophie Carter, tapped her acrylic nails on the keyboard, her eyes flickering up with a smile that was all routine, no warmth. It was the kind of smile you give when you're about to say no. Checking in, Sophie asked, her tone polite, but edged with impatience, her pen already poised as if to dismiss the interaction. Andrea's lips curved into a warm, unassuming smile, the kind that disarmed without effort. Yes, under Mitchell Andrea. Sophie's fingers danced across the keys, then stopped. Her brow furrowed, and she leaned closer to the screen as if it might reveal a mistake she could correct. I don't see a reservation under that name. That's all right, Andrea said, her voice steady, almost soothing. There's always a suite held for me. Owner's block. Sophie's smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of skepticism that tightened her lips. Ma'am, we're at full capacity tonight, she said, her tone sharpening. You'd need a confirmed booking to stay here. Guests only. The words landed like a gavel final, and unyielding, as if Andrea were a stranger who'd wandered into a world where she didn't belong. Andrea's smile held, but the air in the lobby shifted a subtle tightening, like the moment before a storm. She glanced past Sophie to the gold plaque mounted above the desk, Grandview Lux, a Mitchell property. Her name wasn't just on a guest list. It was woven into the very identity of this place. She'd built it 17 properties across the country, each one a testament to her vision of luxury that welcomed everyone of service, that saw every guest as human. And yet here she was, in her own creation, being told she was an outsider. I am a guest, Andrea said, her voice low, deliberate, each word carrying the weight of years. And more than that, I own this hotel. Sophie blinked, her mouth parting slightly, as if Andrea had just claimed to be a visiting dignitary. For a moment, she seemed frozen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then her lips curled into a smirk, a flash of disbelief that spoke volumes. You own the Grandview. The question was laced with doubt, a challenge wrapped in politeness. Andrea nodded, her calm, unshaken eyes locked on Sophie's. Yes, I do. Sophie leaned toward the desk phone, her movements quick, almost defensive. I'm going to have to call the manager. Go ahead, Andrea replied, her voice steady, her posture unyielding. She didn't fidget, didn't shift her weight, didn't give Sophie the satisfaction of seeing her waver. But inside, a quiet fire sparked not rage, but something deeper, a resolve forged through decades of moments just like this. Across the lobby, the couple in golf polos paused, their martinis forgotten. A man in a tweed jacket by the fireplace lowered his newspaper, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. A young woman with earbuds glanced up from her phone, sensing the shift in the room. Andrea felt their stares, the familiar weight of assumptions. She knew that look, the one that said, "Someone's not telling the truth, and we think we know who." Moments later, a man emerged from a side door, his tie slightly askew, a clipboard clutched tightly in his hand. His badge read, Assistant Manager Ethan Walsh. He was thin, his movements hurried, his smile overly bright, as if he could defuse the situation with sheer enthusiasm. "Good evening," he said, his eyes darting between Andrea and Sophie. "Is there a problem with your reservation? She claims to own the hotel." Sophie said, her voice carrying across the lobby, drawing more glances. Ethan hesitated, his smile faltering. He adjusted his glasses, peering at Andrea as if trying to place her in a mental catalog of faces. Andrea met his gaze, unflinching. "I don't claim." "I do. My name is Andrea Mitchell. You'll find it on every quarterly report, every executive board memo. I'm here for one night. There should be a suite held under the owner's block." Ethan's expression wavered, caught between doubt and caution. "Right, just give me one moment, please." He turned, muttering into his walkie-talkie, his voice low but urgent, the words owner and verify cutting through the static. Andrea stood still, her duffel still slung over her shoulder, her presence a quiet anchor in the growing tension. Then security appeared, not aggressive, but deliberate. One guard stationed himself near the elevators. His arms crossed, his eyes scanning the room. Another lingered by the coffee bar, his posture casual but pointed. Just in case. Andrea's gaze didn't waver, but inside that fire burned brighter, not because they didn't know her name, though that stung, but because they looked at her and saw someone who didn't belong. Again. She could have pulled out her ID, flashed emails from the corporate board, or shown photos from the ribbon cutting 6 years ago, when she'd stood on this very spot, scissors in hand, a crowd cheering as the Grandview Lux opened its doors. She could have raised her voice, demanded respect, made a scene that would echo across social media by morning. But Andrea Mitchell didn't make scenes. She made a change. She stepped back, pulled out her phone, and made one call. 26 seconds. That's all it took. She gave her name, her location, and said, "I've been denied access to my own property. I need this resolved immediately." Then she waited. Andrea didn't pace or sigh. She didn't check her watch or record the moment for posterity, as some might have, eager to capture proof of injustice. She stood by a marble pillar, her duffel at her feet, her posture calm but unyielding. The lobby continued its rhythm, guests checking out a bellhop, pushing a cart of luggage, the soft clink of teaspoons against porcelain at the coffee bar. But there was a shift, a ripple of attention. 3 women near the window whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting toward her. A young man with a laptop pretended to type his glances, betraying his curiosity. The doorman, who'd been chatting with a guest moments ago now, stood silent, his gaze flickering between Andrea and the front desk. At the desk, Sophie kept typing, her fingers moving faster now, as if the computer might conjure a reservation that wasn't there. Ethan returned a folder in hand, his face a mix of nerves and forced confidence. "Miss Mitchell," he said, emphasizing her last name as if testing its weight. I think there's been a mix-up. We just need to verify. You can verify all you want. Andrea cut in her voice, gentle but firm, like a blade wrapped in silk. I'm not moving. Ethan glanced at the security guard by the elevators, who hadn't budged. The air was thick now, a quiet standoff unfolding. Sophie's nails tapped faster, her eyes darting between the screen and Andrea. Then Andrea saw it. Sophie slipping her phone from under the desk, her thumb scrolling searching. Probably Googling Andrea Mitchell, Grandview Lux. Probably expecting nothing. Andrea almost smiled a bitter edge to the thought. It would have been funny if it weren't so familiar. She'd been here before, not just in this lobby, but in others, in boardrooms, in banks, in moments that stretch back to her earliest days. At 22, she'd worked night shifts at a budget motel in St. Paul, her uniform stiff, her flats pinching her toes. Guests called her honey, mistook her for the cleaner left tips, as if doing her a favor. Her first boss, a gruff man with a penchant for micromanaging, told her she talked too educated for the front desk and moved her to night audit thinking it would break her. It didn't. It was the spark that lit her fire. At 28 in Milwaukee, she'd walked into a hotel as a newly minted VP, her suit 2 sizes too big, her heels blistering her feet. Security trailed her from the moment she entered their eyes, tracking her like she was a potential thief. Only the CFO's arrival, his hand extended in recognition, saved her from being escorted out. At 35 in Atlanta, a bank manager assumed she was an assistant, not the lead on a $12 million deal, and handed her his coffee order. At 42 in Chicago, a board member mistook her for the caterer asking her to refill the water pitchers. Each time she'd had to prove herself, to pull out the invisible credentials that her name, her face, her very existence seemed to demand. And now, at 48, in a building with her name on the deed, she was still proving. She thought of her mother Clara, who'd worked as a seamstress in Minneapolis, her fingers calloused from years of stitching dresses for women who never knew her name. Clara had taught her to stand tall, to speak clearly, to never let anyone make her feel small. You don't need their permission to be who you are, she'd said, her voice firm as she pinned fabric late into the night. Andrea had carried those words through every slight, every dismissal, every moment when the world tried to shrink her. They were with her now, steadying her as she stood in this lobby waiting. The elevator dinged sharp and clear, cutting through the tension. 2 men stepped out, their movements purposeful, their faces taut with urgency. One wore a gray suit, a clipboard tucked under his arm. The other was in a company fleece, his tablet glowing with notifications. Andrea recognized them instantly. Regional Vice President Daniel Harper and District Manager Miguel Torres. Their eyes found her immediately, and for the first time, she saw panic not in her, but in them. Daniel approached his steps, quick, barely glancing at Ethan. "Miss Mitchell, we are so sorry. I just got the call." Miguel followed his voice, breathless, his tablet clutched like a lifeline. "We're taking care of this right now." Ethan opened his mouth, but Daniel silenced him with a look sharp and final. Sophie froze her phone, slipping back under the desk, her face paling as realization hit. She knew now. They all did. Suite 1202 has been cleared. Miguel said, his fingers flying over his tablet. The driver's being rerouted to take you anywhere you need in the morning. Your usual fruit tray and espresso order will be waiting. Andrea gave a small nod, the faintest trace of a smile playing on her lips. "Thank you." But she wasn't done watching. She studied their faces, their postures, the way their voices shifted now that they knew who she was. She wanted to see how power moved when it entered the room, because this wasn't just about a room key, it was about respect, and how it too often came, only after recognition, not before. Miguel pulled Ethan aside, his voice low, but sharp words like protocol and review slicing through the air. Daniel was already on the phone, his tone clipped, mentioning HR service misconduct and immediate action. The tension that had once been aimed at Andrea now turned inward, a storm brewing among the staff. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She walked back to the desk, her steps slow and deliberate, and placed her phone on the counter, the gesture quiet but commanding. "I'll take the 12th floor suite," she said, her voice even unwavering. "Same setup. Send someone up to confirm it's clean." Sophie opened her mouth, but no words came. Her hands trembled slightly, her nails no longer tapping. Andrea didn't wait for her to find her voice. She turned to Daniel. "Have I been checked in?" "Just finished," he replied, flipping his clipboard with a nervous flick. "2 key cards and an incident report by the time you're in the elevator." "Good," Andrea said. "And the rest?" Daniel nodded, his face tight. Site-wide notification issued. "Corporate audit team is on standby. All staff will undergo recertification on guest protocol. Disciplinary actions start tonight." Andrea's eyes flicked to Sophie, who was now biting the inside of her cheek, her nails tapping a nervous, uneven rhythm. "You'll speak to her," Andrea said plainly, her gaze steady. Daniel cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am." "Privately, with HR present." Miguel looked ready to add something, but Andrea raised a hand, a small gesture that silenced the room. "I'll speak to her too." "Not now, after I've rested." She took the key cards, gave a single nod, and walked toward the elevator. Heads turned. A woman in a red scarf paused mid-sentence, her eyes following Andrea's path. A businessman with a briefcase slowed his stride, watching. But no one spoke to her directly. The elevator doors opened, and as they closed, she caught a final glimpse of Ethan standing rigid by the desk, sweat beading on his forehead, his clipboard forgotten. The 12th floor suite was a haven of quiet elegance, its air scented with lemon and eucalyptus, a crisp contrast to the heaviness of the lobby. A fruit tray sat on a glass table, mango slices, strawberries, and blueberries arranged with meticulous care. Espresso pods were stacked neatly beside a gleaming machine, and a handwritten card with AM in elegant script rested nearby, a rushed but sincere gesture. Andrea walked through the room slowly, her eyes scanning every detail, not just for cleanliness, but for intention, for proof that someone still understood the vision she'd poured into this place. Because the Grandview Lux wasn't just a hotel. It was her story carved from years of struggle and triumph. At 33, she'd stood in a Minnesota bank, pitching her first property to a room of white-haired lenders who barely looked at her, their eyes glazing over as she spoke of accessible luxury. They'd offered terms so brutal, she'd nearly walked away, but her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You don't need their permission." She signed the papers, built the hotel, and proved them wrong. Then she built another and another, until 17 properties stretched from Baltimore to Phoenix, each one a promise that luxury could be human, that service could see every guest as worthy. And yet here she was still proving that promise applied to her too. She set her duffel on the floor, its worn canvas a reminder of her roots. She thought of her mother again, Clara, who'd sewn dresses by lamplight, her fingers nimble despite the ache in her joints. Clara had never seen the Grandview Lux passing away before Andrea's first hotel opened, but her spirit was in every detail: the warm lighting, the inclusive ethos, the commitment to dignity. Andrea had built this empire not just for herself, but for Clara, for every woman who'd been made to feel small. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A message from her assistant, Lauren Everything in Motion. Media statement. Andrea's thumb hovered over the screen. One post on X1 call to a journalist, and this could be everywhere. The headlines would scream, "Black CEO denied entry to her own hotel." It would trend, spark outrage, fuel debates. But Andrea didn't want outrage. She didn't want viral moments or performative apologies. She wanted change, real, lasting, the kind that reshaped hearts and systems, not just headlines. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded, the city's lights flickering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Des Moines hummed below, cars weaving along Grand Avenue, a freight train's horn echoing in the distance, the pulse of a city that never fully slept. But inside the suite, it was still heavy with the weight of what had happened. A knock at the door broke the silence. Room service. A young man, barely 20, carried in a fresh espresso, a note from the kitchen manager apologizing profusely, and an offer for a complimentary massage. His name tag read, Jaden. His eyes were wide, nervous, but kind. "Thank you, Jaden." Andrea said, her voice warm but distant. He nodded, almost bowing, and backed out of the room. She closed the door, took a slow sip of the espresso, its bitterness grounding her. She thought of her younger self, 22, scrubbing motel floors in St. Paul, dreaming of a world that saw her. She'd been invisible then, just as she'd been invisible tonight, until she wasn't. That was the paradox of her life. She'd built an empire to be seen, but the world still needed reminding. At 6:30 a.m., Andrea descended the elevator, no longer just a guest, but the CEO in full command. Her charcoal suit was sharp, her ivory blouse crisp, her heels clicking with a rhythm that demanded attention. The lobby, just waking with the clatter of early checkouts, and the aroma of fresh coffee, seemed to pause when she appeared. Staff straightened, conversations hushed, and the barista at the corner kiosk fumbled a milk pitcher, her eyes wide with recognition. Daniel and Miguel waited by the fireplace, 3 folders stacked on the table between them, 2 untouched coffee cups cooling nearby. They looked like they hadn't slept, their faces drawn, their postures tense. Andrea gave a slight nod and led the way to the executive conference room, a small space tucked past the concierge desk. They followed their steps, hurried, their silence heavy with accountability. Inside, Ethan sat stiffly, his tie still crooked, his clipboard nowhere in sight. Sophie, her name tag gleaming under the fluorescent lights, stared at her hands, her nails now still. A woman from HR, Ellen Parker, introduced herself with a curt nod, her notepad open, pen poised. Andrea didn't sit. She stood at the head of the table, arms folded, her presence filling the room like a storm waiting to break. "Would someone like to explain what happened last night from your perspective?" she asked, her voice low, deliberate, cutting through the silence like a blade. Sophie looked down her shoulders, hunching. Ethan cleared his throat, but said nothing. The silence stretched, dense and uncomfortable. Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice barely audible. I didn't expect, you didn't expect someone like me to own the building." Andrea finished, her tone calm but piercing. Sophie nodded, her face flushing. "Was I rude to you?" Andrea asked. Sophie shook her head. "No, ma'am." "Did I raise my voice?" "No." "Did I threaten anyone?" Sophie's voice was a whisper now. No. Andrea took a slow breath, her eyes shifting to Ellen. I don't want this to be a firing squad, but I need accountability. Ellen nodded. Understood. Miguel spoke up, his tablet glowing in his hands. We're issuing a formal write-up for Sophie, removing her from front desk rotation until recertification. Ethan's on administrative review, pending further interviews. Andrea nodded, then sat, her movements deliberate. She turned to Sophie. How long have you worked here? 4 months, Sophie murmured. And at that time, have you ever thought about who built this hotel? Where did it came from? Sophie hesitated, then shook her head. I thought it was a corporation, maybe. Investors. Andrea let the words hang, her gaze steady. 17 properties, she said, from Baltimore to Phoenix. Each one built with intention, luxury that's accessible, service that's human. I created this brand because I was tired of being invisible. So tell me why. When I walk into my own lobby, I'm still a shadow to the people working under my name. The question wasn't angry. It was weary, raw, heavy. Sophie shrank into her chair, her eyes glistening. Ethan's face reddened, his gaze fixed on the table. Daniel spoke, his voice steady but careful. We've drafted a memo for every Mitchell property. Mandatory inclusivity training staff-wide, no exceptions. It's a reset. Andrea's gaze didn't soften. It's not enough to check a box. I don't want scripts memorized. I want people to understand what respect looks like when no one's watching. Miguel nodded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. We'll make it real. She stood the meeting over. As she left the room, the lobby seemed to shift. Staff moved faster, their nods more deferential. But Andrea wasn't interested in performance. She was looking for change. She waited until the morning rush thinned the lobby, settling into a quieter rhythm. No ringing phones, no guests demanding attention, just stillness. She found Sophie in the staff lounge, seated alone at a narrow table, a half-eaten blueberry muffin in front of her. Her phone was face down. Her eyes tired, her posture defeated. Andrea didn't send for her. She walked in, pulled out the chair across from Sophie, and sat. Sophie sat up, nearly knocking over her coffee. Relax, Andrea said, her voice soft but firm. I just want to talk. Sophie nodded, her eyes down. Okay. They sat in silence, the hum of the fridge and the buzz of overhead lights filling the space. Then Andrea spoke. Have you ever worked somewhere that made you feel small? Sophie looked up, surprised. Yeah, most places. She hesitated, then continued, her voice gaining strength. I worked at a diner off I-80 for a year. Paper hat, greasy apron. Cooks yelled at me every shift. Customers called me kid, even though I was 27. Some didn't tip, some ignored me completely. I felt like no one saw me. Andrea leaned back, her eyes softening slightly. So, you know what it's like to be invisible? Sophie nodded, her eyes glistening. Then help me understand? Andrea said, her voice steady. How you looked at me last night and decided I didn't belong. Sophie's breath caught her hands twisting in her lap. I don't know. I didn't mean to. You walked in and I thought you were lost or waiting for someone. You didn't look like. She stopped, her face flushing. Like what? Andrea pressed her tone, gentle but unyielding. Like someone who owns hotels. Sophie didn't answer her silence in admission. That's the problem, Andrea said. People have a picture in their head. Clean cut, probably male, probably white, definitely not me. That picture shapes what you do, how you treat people. I'm sorry, Sophie said, her voice breaking. I'm really sorry. Andrea nodded slowly. It's a start. But I'm not here for apologies. I want you to see me not as your boss, not as a warning, but as a person. Sophie's eyes widened. I was you once. Andrea continued, her voice softening with memory. Receptionist at a motel in St. Paul, 1999. I was 22 in a uniform that didn't fit, dreaming of something bigger. Got called honey, mistaken for the janitor. My first boss said I sounded too educated for phones and stuck me on night audit. Every time someone dismissed me, I had to choose fight or let it go. When I got to the boardroom, I swore I'd build places where people like you could grow. But growth means seeing everyone who walks through that door. Sophie's voice was barely audible. You really started as a receptionist. Andrea smiled, a rare warmth breaking through. St. Paul, 1999. I was 22 scrubbing floors, dreaming of a world that saw me. That was the start. Sophie let out a small laugh, disbelieving. That's incredible. It shouldn't be, Andrea said. It should be normal. She stood, her presence still commanding. I don't need perfection, Sophie. I need awareness. Every guest, old, young, dressed up or not, deserves dignity. Start there, and you won't have to recover from nights like last night. Sophie stood too, wiping her eyes. Thank you for talking to me. I mean it. Andrea nodded and walked out, a weight lifting from her shoulders. The message had landed not just with Sophie, but somewhere deeper where change begins. By mid-morning, the Grandview Lux hummed with its usual rhythm, guests rolling suitcases, coffee cups clinking, a family asking about the zoo. But in the management office, the air was different. Daniel stood by the window, watching the valet shuffle cars, his face etched with worry. Miguel typed furiously, drafting the memo that would go to every Mitchell property. Ellen reviewed training modules, her pen moving with purpose. Andrea sat at the center, flipping through personnel files, her focus razor sharp. I'm not here to punish, she said, her voice cutting through the silence. I'm here to prevent repetition. Miguel looked up. We're revising the hiring process, empathy tests, bias evaluations, not just skills. Good, Andrea said, tapping her pen. And put me on the rotation. Starting next quarter, I'll visit properties unannounced like I did here. Daniel's eyebrows shot up. A secret guest. Not secret, Andrea said. Anonymous until I'm not. Miguel grinned, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. That'll keep everyone on their toes. Good, she said. This job doesn't come with warnings. She stood, sliding the files into a folder. New training by next Friday. Include real guest stories, not scripts. I want human words, lived experiences. Daniel nodded. Done. Andrea left the office, pausing by the reception desk. A new agent, Jaden, greeted her with respect, his eyes showing he knew who she was. She nodded back, her gaze sweeping the lobby. It looked the same, but she felt it cracks, forming in old habits, the first signs of change. Upstairs, her suite was pristine. Her bag packed, her laptop ready. A note sat on the nightstand, written on plain notepad paper. Miss Mitchell, thank you for your grace. I'll do better. Sophie. Andrea folded it carefully, slipping it into her purse. It wasn't much, but it was real. Before leaving, Andrea sought out one more conversation, not with Sophie, but with Jaden, the young room service worker who'd brought her espresso the night before. She found him in the kitchen, stacking trays, his movements quick but careful. He looked up, startled, when she entered. Miss Mitchell? He said, wiping his hands on his apron. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, Jaden, she said, her voice warm. I just wanted to say thank you for last night. You were kind. He blinked, surprised. I was just doing my job. Andrea smiled. That's the point. You did it with care. That matters. She paused, studying him. How long have you been here? 6 months, he said. hoping to move up to the front desk someday. You will, she said. Keep seeing people, not just guests. That's what makes the difference. Jaden nodded, a spark of pride in his eyes. Andrea turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Miss Mitchell, I heard what happened. I'm sorry. You shouldn't have to deal with that. She looked back, her smile soft but steady. Thank you, Jaden, but I've been dealing with it my whole life. The trick is not letting it define you. She left the kitchen, her heels echoing through the corridor. The car waited outside the doorman, holding the door with newfound warmth. Safe travels, Miss Mitchell, he said. We hope to see you again. You will. She replied, her smile carrying a promise. As the car pulled away, Andrea didn't look back. She'd left something behind, not just the weight of being misjudged, but the seed of something better, understanding, accountability, growth. The ride to the airport was quiet, the city passing in a blur of brick and neon. In her hand, she held Sophie's note, a small reminder that last night hadn't been for nothing. She thought of her mother, Clara, and the lessons she'd carried from those late-night sewing sessions. She thought of her younger self, dreaming in that St. Paul motel, believing in a world that could see her. She'd built that world 17 properties strong, but it wasn't enough. Because even now, people looked at her and saw something less. So what do you do when the world refuses to see you? You see yourself clearly, unapologetically. You walk in, hold your ground, and act like the door was always yours. At the airport, the terminal buzzed with travelers, their voices a chaotic hum. Andrea moved through them, invisible again, but steady. She'd turned a moment of dismissal into a mirror, forcing everyone in that hotel to see themselves. And mirrors don't lie. She hoped Sophie would grow. Ethan would learn, Daniel and Miguel would deliver. But if they didn't, she'd still stand. She always had. For anyone who'd ever been doubted, dismissed, or told they didn't belong, Andrea had one truth. You don't need to shout. Know who you are. Walk like it, and let the world catch up. Let them wonder how they missed you. And when they see you, make sure they never forget.